Yes, sure. This is a talk about giving antidepressants to children. And part of the problem is an increasing number of French teenagers and children are being given drugs like the antidepressants. And that had terrible consequences for Roman, who is the son of Yoko and Vincent, who are here. He was only 16 when he went on these pills. He didn't have a mental illness. He didn't need to go on these pills. The dose of the pills got put up a few times, and every time the dose was put up, he got worse. So it's a very clear-cut case that the best explanation for what happened to Roman, that he took his own life, was that the pills caused it. Now you can see he's a young man who looks, well, he was very bright, very intelligent, he looks friendly, he had loads of friends, he was a very normal young man. Earlier on this year there was a report here in France which raised the issue of what's happening to our children, our teenagers. Why are they being put on all these drugs like the antidepressants and the mood stabilizers and tranquilizers? And part of the answer that you got in a report like this was that they should get more therapy rather than pills. That's not my answer. I mean, I don't know how many of you here when you were teenagers got therapy. I know for sure you rarely got drugs like the antidepressants. But I don't know that any of you needed therapy either. Most of us are normal to begin with, okay? But the issue is there, it's on the radar. People are concerned about what's happening, young people here in France and elsewhere in the Western world. This is not just France. And this report featured in the media, and the media report, child psychiatrists saying, the report you've just seen is, it's too critical. Doctors aren't that bad, drugs aren't that bad. We need more child psychiatrists, was the view that was often offered. So here's Roman again, and he's over there as a little baby with Yoko and Vincent. And the article that this comes from was written by Ariane, and she's the person who's actually responsible for me being here this evening. She's been working on the key group of drugs here. In English, it's the SSRI antidepressants. In French, it's the ISRS antidepressants. Drugs like Prozac, Zoloft, Deroxat. She has a book on all this, and she's been working on these issues for years now. And I should say one more thing. One of the puzzles about Roman's case, and you guys may have a view about this, is it's terribly hard, it's almost impossible to get an expert in France, a French doctor who's willing to say these drugs can cause a problem. So, as I said, this is not just an issue for here in France. This is the New York Times last August, so less than a year ago. And the article is saying that this girl, this teenage girl, is on 10 psychotropic drugs. She's on a few antidepressants, a few mood stabilizers, stimulants, tranquilizers, and hundreds of people comment on this, and they all agree this is happening to teenagers in the United States. They're on up to 10 different drugs at the same time. Nobody is clear why it's happening. Everybody agrees it is happening. No one's very clear on why it's happening. And this talk will try and shed a little bit of light on why it's happening. The story that I want to tell you began here in Boston 33 years ago when these 3 clinical people, 2 doctors, 1 nurse, reported on the case of 6 people who have been put on the newly released drug Prozac. Prozac's fluoxetine. It was made by a pharmaceutical company called Eli Lilly. And these 3 authors reported that they'd been treating 6 people, and they were convinced that these people had become suicidal on Prozac, that the drug had caused the problem. Why did they think so? Well, when you gave the drug, the problem appeared. The person was depressed but hadn't been suicidal beforehand. When you gave the drug, they became suicidal. When you stopped the drug, the problem cleared up. When you reintroduced the drug, the problem came back. So it seemed very clear-cut. And one more key thing was they believed the patients. When patients said, look, doctor, I've been depressed before and my illness has made me suicidal, but this is different. The way the pill's making me feel suicidal is very different to the way the illness did. Now, within a year of this article coming out, something like 20 different groups of doctors in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and around the world reported, we have seen the same thing. We've seen people put on Prozac become suicidal. This report is talking about children. These authors are saying we have seen the children we're treating become suicidal, and they looked at the number of children that they were treating and the number that became suicidal, and they said 1 in 7 is becoming suicidal. So it's a fairly big number. At the time, I was also part of a group that reported on people becoming suicidal on Prozac. This is adults becoming suicidal. And here's the response from the pharmaceutical company. This is Eli Lilly, who make Prozac, who have an article that you see here, which appears in the British Medical Journal. And they're trying to make the case that our clinical trials have shown, the clinical trials we did on this drug have shown Prozac cannot make you become suicidal. And they said, you've seen reports from Boston and Yale and various different places talking about very sad cases of people who became suicidal and sometimes killed themselves. But they're anecdotes. And the plural of anecdote is not data. They said it's depression that makes you suicidal, not our pills. And the key thing they said was randomized controlled trials like this, that's essai clinique randomisé, have I got that right, Ariane? Vaguely. Okay, that they're the way to prove a drug does something or not. What you need to know is the original phrase is the plural of anecdote is data. Google wouldn't work if the plural of anecdote wasn't data. You need to know that the company had healthy volunteer trials where healthy volunteers were given this drug and became suicidal, and some of their healthy volunteers committed suicide. This is the key point, though, which is if you look at the data in this article, what you see is that there was an excess of suicidal events on Prozac compared to placebo, even in this article. But the company said they don't exist because they're not statistically significant. I've learned since I came here, there's an English phrase that does not translate into French, and it's called cook the books. Livre les cuisines, cuisiner les livres, sorry, cuisiner les livres does not mean the same thing as cook the books in English, which is manipulate the data, make it fraudulent. When you uncook the books, when you unmanipulate the data, you find that the data in Lilly's trials was statistically significant showing that Prozac does cause people to commit suicide. So, what we could call evidence-based medicine, what a doctor or a parent or family member looking at a person says, you know, it's clear this drug is causing a problem, can be reconciled with what this article created, which is what in English is called evidence-based medicine. It's nice to think that what we see in a clinical trial looks the same as what people see in the clinic. But even if it didn't look the same, that's good for science. It's a puzzle for people to try and work out why the clinical trial shows one thing and what's happening in the clinic shows a different thing. That's good science. Lilly should be saying, hey, we've got something different here, let's work out what's going on. That's not what they were saying, and it was very clear why not, because they had cooked the books and they didn't want anyone to look closely at what they had done. But more to the point, the key thing is their argument was religious. They are saying to you, we are the only people that can do science. You can't. When you see something obvious on a drug happening to a member of your family, you can't believe it. You can't believe that it's caused by the pill. You have to believe our view about what our pill does. Now, that's like papal infallibility. That's not science. I've talked about science and the English. I'm not English, I'm Irish, okay? Hang on, we've gone one slide too far. The English have a view about where science happened, which is not the same view that people have here in France. They say it began in 1660 with a thing called the Royal Society. And the ground rules for this was a group of people, men mostly, saying, we're not going to deal with questions like the meaning of life. We're not going to deal with theological questions. We're going to deal with questions that can be settled by data. And whether you're Christian or Hindu or Muslim or Jew or atheist, you leave your beliefs outside, you come into the room and look at an experiment happening in front of you, and you've got to come to a consensus view about the best way to explain that. Now, when this history is told, people focus on the word data, but the important word is settled. We have to agree between us what's happening in the apparatus in front of us. When a person takes a drug, we've got to agree between us what's happening to them when maybe they try to kill themselves. And let me explain an important thing here, which is, as you know, the English get on very well with the French. And if any English politician tries to get too close to the French, they get their head chopped off, the way Walter Raleigh did 400 years ago. And after he was executed for being too close to the French, the English legal system said, you know, we've done something wrong here. We've convicted him on the basis of things that people said he had said or said he had done, but they weren't brought into court to be cross-examined. So the legal system said a jury of 12 people, like you, must come to a verdict, must come to a diagnosis based simply on what you see in front of you. You cannot bring anything else. You can't pay heed to anything else. So the stuff that you don't see in front of you, the stuff that people talk about outside the court, is what in English is called hearsay. Or it could these days be called misinformation. So let's say, I don't know who to pick, Chris, who's behind the camera. Where are you, Chris?
Here.
Oh, you're there, right, okay. Let's say Chris, 30 years ago, came to me and he was feeling strange and maybe unhappy. And I said, well, we'll try this new drug, Prozac. And we put him on Prozac, And he came back to me a week later saying, look, I'm feeling really weird and strange, okay? And I'm having thoughts that I've never had before. We have an option to stop the drug and see if the problem clears up. If it clears up and we're very brave, we can put him back on the drug and see what happens. Maybe I have known him for a long time and know I can trust him and I know what he's like normally and I can see what he's like on the pill. And then if he and I agree, look, the best way to explain this is Prozac has caused the problem, we could even bring him here and you guys can ask him any questions you want and ask me any questions you want about why I think this drug may be causing the problem. And if we all ultimately agree, look, the best way to explain this, there's nothing else going on in his life. He's a millionaire, he's got a happy marriage, everything is just perfect. If the best way to explain this is the drug has caused the problem, we can report this to the European Medicines Agency, EMA. We can send the report to them. And the first thing they will do is to remove his name and mine. If one of you has a child who becomes suicidal on one of these drugs, and you want to take a legal case against the doctor or the hospital or whatever, and let's say you're doing it now, so this is 30 years later, and you say to the court, there's tens of thousands of reports of people becoming suicidal on this drug, the legal system will say to you, that's all hearsay. It's not evidence. No one can be brought into court to be examined. Chris's name isn't there. No one knows who the report came from. If, on the other hand, Chris agreed that he and I write up the report and send it to a medical journal with our names remaining on it, you can say to the court, look, there are reports. We can bring these two people into court and examine them. You can sort of see how when the lawyer for the pharmaceutical company asks them questions, you can look and see how credible you think Chris's answers are and mine. That's evidence. The point I'm making is your names count. Removing your name is a serious problem. Your views count. In company trials, one of the things that will happen if one of your children is harmed by any drug, any harm, any drug, is that the company will say, we've done clinical trials and our trials show there's no harms here. But I have to tell you, in company trials, EMA have never seen the results from company trials. They don't have the data. There's no names on these. Nobody can be brought into court. So company trials are not evidence either. The only evidence we have is if someone like Chris or me have our names on a report, and that can be the kind of thing that will influence you if you're in the jury. You could work out what weight to put on it. I've told you all about the fact that companies say their clinical trials are crucial. They also know the value of a good story. This is Matt Miller, who was 13 years old when he got put on Zoloft. And he became agitated on it. His parents reported that he became agitated. His grandparents reported that he became agitated on it. And a week after he was put on Zoloft, he hung himself in the bathroom between his parents' bedroom and his bedroom.
We did not understand the word. He became
agitated, yeah. You know, restless, pacing, unhappy. So after he hung himself in the bathroom between his parents' bedroom and his bedroom, Pfizer sent investigators to the family home to comb the carpet for semen. They wanted to argue this was autoerotic asphyxiation gone wrong. The obvious thing was the drug had caused him to commit suicide, but they're happy to look at other possibilities and try and persuade the court that what had really happened was this 13-year-old boy And this is 21 or 2 years, more, 23 or 4 years ago, before we had the internet and before teenage boys learnt about things like autoerotic asphyxiation. Let me take you on to this. This is study 329, almost at this point the most famous clinical trial, certainly for the antidepressants, and maybe one of the most famous clinical trials in all of medicine. This is a study of GlaxoSmithKline's ISRS, Deroxat, which has been given to teenagers, mostly in North America. And it's published in the journal with the highest impact factor in child psychiatry. It's got an authorship line that you see here, 24 different names, which are the biggest names in the field. So if you're an ordinary doctor looking at an article like this in the best journal in the field with great authors on it, and it says that this drug works well and is safe, you're going to prescribe it. But this trial was published in 2001. 3 years beforehand, it had ended, and GlaxoSmithKline were reviewing the data internally, and I've gone too far. And here's part of an internal GlaxoSmithKline document, which says, our drug didn't work in this trial, and it isn't safe. We're going to pick out the good bits of the data and publish those. This document ended up with the Attorney General in New York State and provided the basis for a fraud charge against GlaxoSmithKline. It later provided the basis for a Department of Justice action against GlaxoSmithKline, which cost the company $3 billion. Not million, billion. The action led a few of us to be able to get access to the raw data behind this trial, data that FDA hadn't seen, data that academics haven't seen, data that no doctor that ever gives the drug had been able to see. So our article appeared in the BMJ in 2015. And what I want to show you here is what the company had published earlier was the first 8 weeks. And over there on the left, you see the first 8 weeks of this trial, and there's no difference between paroxetine and imipramine, which is a drug it's been compared with, and placebo. The company did not publish the 6-month follow-up data, which we did almost 20 years after the trial ended. But again, you can see no difference here between the 2 antidepressants and placebo. But what I want to tell you about really is this. In this trial, when you saw the article that I told you about, the 2001 article, it said 6 children in this trial, and there were nearly 300 children in this trial. 6 of them became emotionally labile, 4 taking paroxetine and 2 taking placebo. Now, for most doctors reading this, we are probably less likely to wonder, what did emotional lability mean, than you would have done if you were reading the article. It was a journalist reading the article, not a doctor, who said, what's this strange term doing here? It turns out that emotional lability is a word that we can all understand. In English, it means your mood goes up and down, but it's also, in this case, a coding term which meant that the child had become suicidal or homicidal. And when we looked at the data, this was the number of children who had become emotionally labile or suicidal, in almost all cases, on paroxetine in this trial. That's 18 of the 93 children who had paroxetine, which is roughly 1 in 6. And it's excessive. It's much greater than the number of children becoming emotionally labile taking either placebo or the other antidepressant. Now, we concluded, well, no, leave that. There's two things I just want to point out here. In the actual paper, we look at 10 ways that the companies can hide data. I'm just going to tell you about two of them. One is coding, which you've just heard about, which is coding suicidal acts under the term emotional lability. It's a term that can be used legally, but it's going to confuse people. They're not going to understand what's really being said. If you don't have access to the data, you're not going to understand what's said. This is a famous picture of a man who kills himself by setting fire to himself. In a Pfizer trial, at the same point that study 329 was happening, the drug being used was one that could also make people become suicidal. And a man in that trial became very agitated and decided to kill himself. He poured petrol over himself and set fire to it. He didn't die there and then. He died 5 days later from his burns. And the company coded his death as death by burns, not death by suicide. Now, when things like this happen, when people die in a trial, companies are legally supposed to write a story about what happened. Where if you got hold of that, which no doctor can and no journal will have seen, you could work out that this should have been coded as death by suicide. Companies have since this learned ways to hide deaths like this, even though they're legally supposed to record them and write a story about what happened. And this is well, it's not a 15-year-old boy, he's a bit older, but this is a boy in the United States out in the street with a gun. In study 329, there was a 15-year-old boy who went on paroxetine and ended up out in the street with a gun threatening to kill people. And there was no other way to explain this except it was the effect of the drug. He was picked up by the police, he was brought to hospital. Because he was brought to hospital, there should be a story about what happened. There isn't. The companies have a trick, which means they don't have to write the story out these days. I found out about it because I had access to internal company emails talking about the problem. FDA and EMA don't know about what happened to this boy in this trial, and they don't seem to know about the trick that companies are still using 30 years later to hide events like this. So let me tell you one more thing, and this is interesting. I told you that GlaxoSmithKline faced a Department of Justice action which cost them $3 billion. Right. One of the ways adverse events in a trial can be hidden is by coding. A different way is this. In the 93 children taking paroxetine in this trial, there were 500 adverse events. You cannot list 500 events in an academic paper. So you group them. You put the cardiac events in one group, the respiratory events in a different group, the neurological events in their own group, and headache is one of the neurological events that can happen, and dizziness. Now, headaches and dizziness are very common things to happen in any clinical trial on any drug. If you include in the neurological group the behavioral events, the children who became suicidal, you can hide them, you can drown it out because headaches and dizziness are so common, and they're in the paroxetine group, the imipramine group, and the placebo group. They're going to make the three groups look very much the same. If you take the behavioral events out and put them in their own group, you see there's a big difference between the three drugs. When we wrote the paper for the BMJ, these usually take 8 weeks from the time the paper goes in to the time it gets rejected or published. A year later, our paper hadn't been published. And the problem was the research editor for the BMJ was saying, we don't like the fact that you've moved these behavioural events out of the neurological group, which makes no sense. They shouldn't have been in the neurological group to begin with. We were puzzled at this, but again and again she said, no, we can't accept the paper because we don't like what you've done. So I Googled her, and her name is here. It's Elizabeth Loader, and she's an expert on headaches. So you can see why she might be sensitive to the topic of headaches. But that still didn't explain what was going on. So I Googled her a bit more, and it turns out her husband's a lawyer. And he works for a company called Ropes and Gray, who are the company who defended GSK in the $3 billion legal action. So once we pointed this out, the BMJ said, okay, we'll publish your article and we'll have the data the way you want it to be. So that's a rather interesting story, I think. So if you want to hear or find out more about this, there's a website called study3to9.org, which will give you all the details. If you want to read a bit more about the story in thriller form, there's this book, which is called Children of the Cure, which even if you don't have any mental health experience, is fairly easy to read. It's in English. We maybe need to get someone to translate it into French, I guess. But anyway, so let me take you to the next bit of the story. This is 2002. This is Newsweek in the United States that's saying, you know, there's 3 million teenagers in the United States who are depressed. Their depression is going to lead them to drug abuse, to alcoholism, to divorce, to career failure, to suicide. But there's hope. The US cavalry are on the horizon. Prozac has been approved for children who are depressed. And what Newsweek know and no one else knows is that paroxetine and Zoloft have also been approved by FDA. Now, most people think Paxil, as it's called in the States, didn't get approved by FDA. But this is something. The machine is having a little problem. It's having a nervous breakdown. Right, great. This is something that very few people ever see. This is part of a letter from FDA in the United States, the US version of EMA, to GlaxoSmithKline, telling them, dear GlaxoSmithKline, you have told us you did 3 studies in children who are depressed. You have told us that all 3 are negative. We agree with you that all 3 of those trials were negative, but we're still going to approve the drug for children who are depressed. We also agree that it would not be helpful to say in the label of the drug to warn doctors or patients that all of the trials of this drug were negative. So why on earth would FDA do this? And here's the published trials for adults of all the antidepressants you see here. The trials were done in adults. And they're almost all positive, okay? There's very few negative trials. Now, what I'm going to say here is going to shock you, but I need to tell you this is not just about the antidepressants. This is true for every class of drug you may be taking. That's the published medical literature. FDA, however, have seen what the company have told them happened in these trials, and half of the trials are negative. Now, the negative trials that don't get published aren't a big problem, but 1/3 of the positive trials up here were in fact negative, So publishing negative trials as positive is a big problem because it's going to influence your doctor to put you on these drugs. And in the case of the articles on antidepressants in children, they were all negative. The clinical trials, they were all negative, but the published articles are all positive. This is 100% difference. So, why would, well, what I should say before that moves, why do FDA not complain about this? Why do EMA not complain about this? And the answer is, they say it's not their job to police the medical literature. They're just there to approve the drug. And, right, okay. Here's something else you need to know. Pfizer did 4 trials on Zola for post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. All 4 were negative. And FDA still approved it. What the company did was to, in 2 of the trials, the results for women weren't negative. They were marginally positive. And that's what FDA approved the drug on. But what I want to show you, this will be a bit hard to read perhaps. It says, look, the articles on these 2 trials are written. They claim the drug works well and has no problems. One is going to go to what is widely thought of as the very best journal in the field, the New England Journal of Medicine. And the other is going to go to a journal called JAMA, which again is one of the big names in the field. Right? So the articles are written. We know which journals they're going to go to. And over here on the left, it says author TBD. The author's name hasn't been determined yet. The person who isn't going to write the article, because it's written already, whose names are going to appear on the authorship line, are going to be decided by Pfizer's marketing department. It's nothing to do with people who run the trial or have access to the data or have analysed the data. Do you remember I showed you study 329 and said it was in the best journal in the field, and there were 22 authors on the authorship line? None of them were authors of that trial. The author was a ghostwriter whose name does not appear on the authorship line of the trial. And that's true for all of the drugs you may be using. A drug to lower your cholesterol levels, a drug for your bone densities, a drug for your breathing, a drug for your heart. It's not just antidepressant drugs. It's true for every drug that you may be on. So yes, this is 2016. This is the front of the British Medical Journal, and that's the Minister of Health back then. And he's saying, this is a bit like the report here in France 3 months ago, saying that children's mental health in the United Kingdom, in the NHS, the National Health System, is a disaster. It's where things are going most badly wrong. Now, if the published literature that your doctor depends on is fake, if it's all saying the drug works well and there are no problems, but the real data says just the opposite, well, what you'd expect is this will be a disaster area, which it is. So, do you guys know the Peanuts cartoons? The Charlie Brown cartoons? So you've got Lucy and Charlie Brown, and Lucy's mission in life is to make life a misery for Charlie Brown, okay? So this Peanuts cartoon, there's 4 of them that all actually go together here. So this is the first one, Lucy doing the usual things she does. But hang on, sorry, sometimes right. Charlie Brown this time is not behaving the way he normally behaves. He's not upset. He's saying, ha, the joke is on me, okay? And he gets up and walks away. And Lucy's puzzled for a moment. But Lucy knows what's going on. And in one sense, while no doctors in France will ever agree a drug caused a problem, Lucy knows exactly what the problem is. Drugs like Prozac can make you suicidal. Drugs like Deroxat can make you suicidal. You know, they can give you thoughts you've never had before. They do something else as well. They make you emotionally numb. So you're not anxious about killing yourself or killing anyone else either. And Lucy realizes that Charlie Brown has been made emotionally numb, so he's not reacting to the way she's treated him. And she knows what to say, which is, Prozac has made her life a misery because Charlie Brown is not behaving the way she wants him to. And one of the other aspects to this is The Simpsons, I guess you guys know about. And here's Homer and Bart. And Bart is saying, this is the most miserable day of my life. And Homer is saying the kinds of things that parents could say to children 30 years ago, but can't say now easily. You know, no, you're a teenager, you need to be crazy, you need to be miserable, that's how you'll learn to cope with this world. But Bart will say to Homer, Dad, I've just completed a rating scale, and the rating scale shows I'm depressed. So, you know, you need to bring me along to a doctor. I need to just tell you a little bit about rating scales, and then we're nearly finished. Okay. In the trials of antidepressants, more people die on the antidepressant than on placebo. So how do FDA and EMA ever license this drug? How do they get to say it works? Well, the answer is they decide that it works on the basis of a rating scale. And this is true for most of the drugs that lower your cholesterol levels. They're not I mean, more people often die on the drug than on the placebo, but they're just looking at your cholesterol levels to try and decide, does the drug work or not? In this case, they're looking at just a small change on a depression rating scale for them to agree, yes, the drug works. Max Hamilton, who made the scale, is saying, a scale like this, you know, changes clinical interviews. It standardizes things. It means when I interview, okay, right? When I interview a patient, you know, the system doesn't want me to ask about their gazpacho recipe, doesn't want me to ask about whether Kylian Mbappe is going to Real Madrid or not. They don't want questions like that. They just want me to stick to the rating scale questions, which include, have you become suicidal? What's your appetite like? What's your sleep like? What's your ability to make love like? Like all things that the drug can affect and the condition can affect. Now, if I interview Vincent and ask him, has he been suicidal in the last week? And he says, yes, he has. If he says, yes, he has, I should score 4 for that item. But if the drug has caused the problem, which it could do, I should score 0. But if we're running a company clinical trial, nobody's allowed to evaluate whether it's the drug rather than the condition that's caused the problem. And in clinical practice these days, no one is told, well, if the patient says they've become suicidal, you should try and stop the drug if you think it could be the drug, or if the patient thinks it could be the drug, in order to work out what's going on. And what this means is we've begun to use things like rating scales like this in clinical trials, but also in clinical practice. Around 1980 is when we began doing it. And what that's done to medicine is this. Up to 1980, you brought problems to a doctor which you wanted to get solved in order so you could live the life that you wanted to live. If I ask you questions on the rating scale, rather than questions about Kylian Mbappe or a recipe for good cheese, for instance, then, you know, I'm going to, if I, as I say, I put the premium on the rating scale questions, I'm going to be helping you to live the life that Pfizer or GlaxoSmithKline want you to live, rather than me helping you to live the life that you want to live. And this brings us back to here and the question of why are so many teenagers on these drugs? And part of the answer is this. When you have a teenager who's a little bit unhappy, she brings a rating scale into a doctor which has a score on it for which companies know their drug is the answer. Whether you've got thinner bones or slower breathing or all sorts of problems, companies know if they can just generate numbers, their pills are going to look like the answer. So she's a little bit unhappy. The rating scale score is a bit high. The doctor says, I have a drug for you. And a week or two later, she becomes suicidal. And the companies have learned if somebody becomes suicidal on these drugs, you tell them, well, you weren't really a simple case of depression. You're bipolar depression. And we need to add a mood stabilizer into the drugs you're on. And among one of the first of the drugs called a mood stabilizer was invented in Lyon. It's an anticonvulsant called valproate. But that may be the drug you'll be given. Chances are you'll be given an antipsychotic drug. And one of the things that does, which can be useful, is to cause you to lose focus. It's a drug which helps you not to focus on things you're focusing on too much. So a week or two after you've been put on this drug, you go back to the doctor and he or she asks you how you are, and you say, well, I'm not too bad, but you know, I can't focus all that well. So he gives you a rating scale for ADHD, which is full of questions about focus, and you tick the boxes and he looks at the figures and says, you've got ADHD. I need to add a stimulant into the mix. And stimulant drugs pull exactly the opposite way to the antipsychotic that he's put you on before. What this is like is getting Vincent to come out here and stand on a weighing scales, and for me then to put a 25 kilogram weight in his right hand and a 25 kilogram weight in his left hand and say, you're 50 kilograms overweight. I need to give you a drug to cause you to lose weight. When in actual fact, I should just remove the weights from his hands. We're doing the same thing when we use rating scales. And right, that article was from nearly a year ago. This is from the Wall Street Journal, and you're not going to be able to see it clearly. This is just 3 weeks ago, and this is the United States, and the Wall Street Journal is reporting that teenagers in the United States have falling life expectancy. You're going to be able to see the key point more clearly in the next slide, which is this. They've got falling life expectancy. And that's the curve we see here. And what the article makes it clear is they're not dying from a physical illness. And they're not dying from COVID. It says COVID and vaccines were less than 10% of the changing figures you see here. They're dying from suicide and homicide and car accidents and overdoses.
Race.
Sorry?
Is our written, is a dado mammal race. And explain.
Let me take you back.
Slide, yeah. No?
Yes.
The previous one.
Where are you looking?
Before.
All right.
Younger
Yes.
than
Sorry. Okay. Yes.
Alarming rates. Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't write it.
Yeah. No. Sure. Good point. Yeah. No. They're saying that they're dying more than they were before, and this is alarming. This is a cause for worry. And it's reversing the progress we had been making for years. This is the first time in nearly 100 years where the rates are now going back up.
Yeah, no, it was a primary lecture.
Yeah. Okay. No, go back one. Go back one.
This one?
Yes, okay. So there's been a change. 50 years ago, everybody would say, most doctors would say to you, the art of medicine is bringing good out of the use of a poison. These medicines are tricky. They're on prescription only because we have every reason to think they're more dangerous than alcohol or nicotine. We're prepared to trust you with alcohol and nicotine, but prescription drugs we figure you can't be trusted with. I'm not sure you can't, but still, the point is everybody knew these were dangerous, and particularly if you were on more than one. The reason this slide is here is we used to have a poison symbol on drugs, Now we've got a culture where even pregnant women are being told you should take more antidepressants and drugs generally during pregnancy. And this was a serious proposal to stamp antidepressants with a picture of a pregnant woman to try and reassure her that it will be a good idea to take these drugs. SSRI drugs increase the rate of miscarriages, increase the rate of birth defects. They are serious. They are not drugs to take during pregnancy. But the point is, I want to give you a bit of German. I don't speak German either. The original Paracelsus phrase, though, is the word for poison is gift. In English, I guess a cadeau, is that the best word? Yeah. So you'll remember there was an old legend, well, an old Homer story about Troy, the siege of Troy. And one of the most famous lines in this is, beware of doctors bearing gifts. Well, not doctors. Beware of Greeks bearing gifts. Beware, I'm trying to say to you, the key line now is beware of doctors bearing gifts, particularly when it comes to your children. Thank you. Just quickly, in 1992, Pfizer's Zoloft came on the market to treat people who are depressed. Now, the ISRS group of drugs are not good antidepressants. They're much weaker than an older generation of drugs that we had. But 10 years before Zoloft came on the market, there was a healthy volunteer trial done in England where every single one of the women who were put on Zoloft dropped out before a week was over because they couldn't tolerate the drug, some of them becoming suicidal. There is a lot of healthy volunteers who have killed themselves on these drugs. So the drugs can cause the problem. The key thing is the relationship between your doctor and you. It needs to be a relationship where you get told, look, these drugs can help, but they may not be the right drug for you. Among the antidepressants, there's 4 different kinds of antidepressants. The ISRS group of drugs may not suit you, but a different one might. And the important thing is that I help create a relationship with you where if it doesn't suit you, you can tell me, okay? And we can change you from that drug. One of the things that's come up lately in the UK, in an article in the United Kingdom this week, which is a very good article about a young man who went on to commit suicide on one of these drugs. He was only on it for a week. And the article lays the case out well, but it says something at the end of it, which is a real problem. In the UK, their version of EMA is called MHRA. So the journalist felt required to ask MHRA, or EMA if you want, what they're going to do about this problem, about some people becoming suicidal on these drugs. And the MHRA said, well, we're looking into it. We're constantly checking it out to see that the drug causes a problem. These drugs have been on the market for 30 years. The MHRA are still checking it out. And they're saying, if you feel bad, you might want to go along and talk to your doctor. Don't stop the drugs before you go and talk to your doctor. The problem with that is a lot of doctors don't recognize that the drug could be causing the problem. If you go back to your doctor, there's a chance he'll say your illness is worse, and he'll double the dose of the drug, which will kill you. Now, I need to take you back 10 years earlier, back to Pfizer, who had every woman who was put on a sertraline that they gave them in this trial drop out because they became agitated. Pfizer wrote a memorandum, a report on what this healthy volunteer trial showed, in which they stated our drug caused this problem. So 10 years before the drugs were launched on the market, the company is saying, our drugs can make you suicidal. But now that the drugs are on the market, they refuse to say our drugs can make you suicidal. Oh, thank you very much. Great. Thanks a lot. It's a bit like the Lucy and Charlie Brown cartoon. Everybody in the pharmaceutical industry knows their drug can make you suicidal. In public, they say that can't happen. The key thing that's going to change this is the relationships we have between your doctor and you. There's no such thing as a best drug. There's no such thing as a drug that can't cause problems either. The key important thing, and much more important than diet or anything else, people talk about drugs, our therapy, are the social determinants of health, but the greatest single determinant of health is the relationships you have. And in this case, when it comes to pills, it's the relationship between your doctor and you. It has to be one where you are told the truth about the drugs and where there's a possibility for you to talk back and tell the doctor something that's happening to you that is not in any books. That's where the doctor has to be open to the fact that, well, you're the person who knows what's happening in you. Let me explain. Very few doctors in the United States get sued if your child has a serious problem like they go on to commit suicide. It's not financially worthwhile for the lawyers. The only kind of cases that are financially worthwhile are to sue the pharmaceutical company, and that's where you learn all of the things you've heard me outline here. So it's useful if you sue a pharmaceutical company, but of course they've got vast resources and very few doctors, no French doctors that I know of, have ever been involved in a legal action against any of the pharmaceutical companies. Yeah, there are legal actions where a doctor may be found guilty that he didn't do the right thing, but that's not a legal action that lawyers take in order to make money. It's, you have a system where things go wrong and there may be an action against the hospital, but there isn't a huge amount of money involved in it. It's not something that's done for money purposes. But you said something at the start, which is you were saying that you don't like psychiatry. Okay. Yeah, no, sure. Sure. Yeah, and I want to pick up on that, which is I'm not anti-psychiatry and not anti-drug and not anti the pharmaceutical industry. My view is a little bit more like Philippe Pinel's view, which is it's wonderful to have treatments that can help, but it's an even greater art to know when not to give them. And one of the places where that comes out most clearly at the moment is we used to be very cautious about giving any of these drugs to teenagers. We're not cautious now. We used to be very cautious, pregnant women used to be very cautious about taking drugs during pregnancy, not just the antidepressants, but any drugs during pregnancy. They're now cautious about taking soft cheeses and processed food, meats and alcohol and nicotine and too much coffee, but they're taking more drugs now than they've ever taken before. It's escalating rapidly, and it's well-educated, university-educated, middle-class people who are doing this. You know, it's not people who haven't been to school and don't know what the issues are. It's people who are very health conscious who are doing this. It's very strange. Sure. Yeah. It's tricky. Part of the problem is doctors figure that they've got to behave according to the guidelines. The guidelines dictate what they should do, and often the guidelines will say, even in the case of children, that you give antidepressant drugs. The problem is the guidelines are based on the literature you've seen. It's not some doctors sitting down and saying, what's the sensible thing to do? It's, you know, we should talk to these children rather than give them pills. The guidelines say if the child is depressed, you prescribe these pills, A, B, C, D. But as I've shown you, the academic literature that says this is what you should do is fake. It's not written by the people who are on the authorship line. It's not written by people who have access to the data. In some cases, it says exactly the opposite to what the company has told the regulator. So that's part of the problem we've got, which is there's nothing to tell a doctor, be sensible. You've got a child here, talk to them. It just says, give them pills. So this is a problem we've got. As doctors who want to use the pills, it's terribly tricky where we've got a fake literature, but you're taking the pills, and and it's not just the antidepressant group of drugs. You need to check and see, does the doctor really know what he's doing? What's the basis on which he's doing it? And if he says, I'm prescribing according to the guidelines, that should be a warning sign to you. Okay, they'll treat you for, they'll treat a child or you for depression. And if you're depressed, you can maybe be a little obsessive as well, and they'll decide you've also got OCD, and they'll look at the guidelines for OCD. And if you're depressed, you may be anxious too, and they'll figure, well, this person is depressed, and they're anxious, and they've got OCD, and the guidelines for each of those recommend pills. One of the problems we've got, one of the things we've lost, is the idea that we should have a guideline for people rather than a guideline for diseases. And a guideline for people would begin by saying you should never be on more than 3 drugs. And if you're on 3, that may be a problem. And if you're a teenager on more than 1, that's a problem. But in terms of the psychotropic drugs, okay, there's 2 things. One is, how do we get you off 10 drugs? How do we get you down to 7 or 6 or 5? Well, there's never going to be any randomized control trial to tell any doctor how to do that. The crucial thing is listening to you. Because if you're on these pills, you know the ones that can cause a problem if you miss them. So they're going to be ones that we need to take more care about. But also, you'll know what's happened to you each time an extra drug was added into the mix. And you're also the person that knows what you want from these treatments. Do you want to live a week longer but be confused for months beforehand because you're on all these pills? Or do you want to have a clear mind and maybe die a week earlier? These choices are yours, and you need to let people know about it. The other problem with the question you asked is, some of these drugs you can't get off because you get hooked to them. And it can be harder to stop an SSRI than it can be to stop heroin. So that's a big problem with these drugs. No, and the problem we've got is, if you've got a difficult problem stopping SSRI drugs, no one knows how to help you. If you don't have a difficult problem, that's great. But if you have a difficult problem, we don't know what the answer to that is. Well, what you've got with all these drugs are drugs that are equivalent to alcohol, or nicotine, or cocaine. Now, if you are taking alcohol and nicotine and cocaine every day of the week for the rest of your life, you would expect, and we would expect, that you wouldn't live as long as you would live if you weren't taking them every day of your life. If you're on 3 prescription drugs, it's likely to be the same effect. Very few of the prescription drugs you'll be on will be saving your life. Most of them have been given to you for what are called risk factors. Your bones are a little bit thin, let's give you a drug to thicken them up. Your blood glucose is a little high, let's give you a drug to bring it down. Your blood pressure's a little bit high, let's give you a drug to bring it down. But putting you on 3 drugs like this is going to shorten your life. So, what we've got to find is a way to help people, not just doctors, but you, to make judgment calls about these things, about what do you really need a drug for. Okay, maybe you're a lady who's over the age of 50 and your bones are a bit thinner, but children's bones are much thinner than yours and they don't break because they keep fit. if you're told your bones are thin and you need a drug to thicken them up, you get nervous and you don't go out and ride your bike or take long walks or exercise. That's the kind of change we need to look at, which is, does this condition, does this risk factor really need a pill? Or are there other ways that things can be handled? So it's a cultural change that we need. Stop thinking that these pills are sacramental, they can only do good and they can't harm you. That's just not true. When you take a pill, you're taking huge risks. Can I ask a question of all of you? Is the problem we've got like cigarette smoking? If you've got a teenager that smokes cigarettes, it's likely they've got a parent that smokes cigarettes. If you've got a teenager taking an SSRI antidepressant, it's likely they have a parent taking one too. This is not absolute, but it's become part of the air we breathe, the way smoking once was. And how do we turn that round? I mean, the experience of people in this group here is that pills have helped them. So the message we will be giving to younger folk is pills can be helpful. But we need, I mean, they're believing that too much. They're thinking pills are the answer to everything. And we need to get them back to a more sensible attitude. But part of the wrong attitude's coming from us. We're too complacent. Let me just add one more quick thing in here. Companies that sell drugs for ADHD used to say, we cannot sell these drugs in places where there are grandmothers. Grandmothers. Because the company knows that if they get the doctor to say, yes, this boy has ADHD, he's overactive, he needs a pill to calm him down, and there's a grandmother there, she'll say, well, his father was just like that and he's turned out okay. You're right. I'm tempted to say that, particularly here in France, where you've got a nice style of life with gorgeous countryside and a lot going for you, you shouldn't be using as many drugs as get used elsewhere, maybe. But aside from that, one of the important things that has changed is these drugs are available on prescription only, because they were put on prescription only in the 1950s when it was thought that all of you didn't know enough about health to be able to work out for yourselves if these drugs were safe. These days, I learn more about what these drugs do from my patients than from the literature. Paracelsus said the art of medicine is bringing good out of the use of a poison. He also said, nature is my book. But in actual fact, for me, as a doctor, or any doctor, or nurse, you are our book. We should be learning from you, and in particular because people, even who have no background in healthcare these days, with Google, can teach me things about the serotonin system. I've got a PhD in the serotonin system these drugs work on, but I've had patients teach me more about the serotonin system than I ever knew. So, my job can be a lot more fun if I just trust you and work with you. And that's really what we should be encouraging. You should encourage doctors like me to listen to you and work with you, because their job can be a lot more fun if they do.
So the patients are doctors?